Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! Harry always had a fascination with time travel. As a physics student, he spent late nights in the lab, tinkering with a prototype time machine, hoping to one day make a breakthrough. So, when the machine suddenly activated, sending him hurtling through time, he was ecstatic. That feeling quickly faded as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. London, 1857. The foggy streets of Victorian London enveloped Harry as he stumbled out of the time portal, disoriented and dizzy. His eyes widened as he took in his surroundings. Horse-drawn carriages clip-clopped on cobblestones, gas lamps glowed softly, and men in top hats and women in hooped skirts bustled by. "Blimey!" Harry exclaimed, his heart racing. "I've gone back in time!" His excitement turned to panic as he realized the full extent of his mistake. The time machine, in its unfinished state, had somehow adapted to the time period, transforming to fit in with the Victorian era. And in this process, it had transformed Harry as well. His hands flew to his mouth, now soft and full-lipped, and he let out a horrified gasp. Harry was now Harrietta, dressed in an elaborate Victorian gown, complete with a corset that hugged her new, slender figure. Her once short, messy hair was now long, cascading in curls past her shoulders. "What the—" Harrietta's voice, now higher-pitched and feminine, trailed off in shock. She spun around, looking for a reflection, and spotted a store window. The image looking back at her was that of a beautiful young woman. "How is this possible?" she whispered, her eyes wide. A group of young men strolled by, tipping their hats at Harrietta with cheeky grins. Flustered, she backed away, her heart pounding. "Easy there, lads," she muttered, her cheeks flushing. This was going to take some getting used to. Harrietta's first challenge was finding shelter. She wandered the streets, drawing curious glances and the occasional wolf whistle before spotting a small inn.
"Excuse me, miss?"
The innkeeper, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, raised an eyebrow at Harrietta's disheveled appearance.
"Are you in some kind of trouble?"
Harrietta's heart raced as she realized the innkeeper assumed she was a lady in distress. "Oh no, she started, her voice faltering. The innkeeper took Harrietta's elbow gently and steered her inside, away from prying eyes. "You look half-starved, dearie. Come have some tea and tell Mrs. Wilson all about it." I'm not quite sure where to start," Harrietta stammered, her eyes darting around the cozy inn parlor. Mrs. Wilson poured 2 cups of steaming tea and passed one to Harrietta, giving her an encouraging smile. "Well, you're safe here. Now, take a breath and tell me everything." Harrietta took a shaky breath and began. "I'm not really sure myself, to be honest. One moment I was in my laboratory, working on an experiment, and the next thing I know, I'm here, in this dress. It's like I've woken up in someone else's body." The innkeeper's eyes widened in surprise, but she kept her composure. "Goodness me! That's quite the tale. And you have no family or friends to turn to?" "No, I'm afraid not. I'm new in town." Harrietta's face burned with embarrassment as she realized how inadequate her story was. Mrs. Wilson nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Well, you can stay here for the time being. I can offer you a job as a maid if you're willing to work. It'll keep you fed and give you a roof over your head while you figure things out." Harrietta's relief was palpable. "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I'd be delighted to work for my keep." And so, Harrietta found herself donning an apron over her gown and learning the ins and outs of being a Victorian maid. The work was hard, but it kept her mind off her strange predicament, and the other servants soon accepted her as one of their own. As the days turned into weeks, Harrietta settled into a routine. She woke early, tended to the fires, and prepared breakfast for the guests, all before most of London was even awake. The physical work was demanding, but she found a certain satisfaction in it, and as she mastered the tasks, a sense of pride began to build. One morning, as she was polishing the banister, she glanced down at her reflection in the wooden pane. Her face, once gaunt and pale, now had a healthy glow, and her eyes sparkled with a new kind of confidence. "Not bad, if I do say so myself," she murmured, running a hand through her thick, lustrous hair. The transformation went beyond the physical, too. She felt more in tune with her emotions and found herself noticing things she never had before: the beauty in a sunset, the complex flavors in a simple meal, the joy in a shared laugh. "You're a natural, Harrietta," Mrs. Wilson said, noticing her apprentice's growing prowess. "You have a way with people, and they warm to you easily. It's a rare gift." Harrietta blushed, pleased with the compliment. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson."
I'm just trying to be myself, or myself as she is now, I suppose.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. One afternoon, as she was carrying a stack of linens up the stairs, a dashing young gentleman emerged from one of the rooms, colliding with her. "Oh!" she exclaimed, as the sheets tumbled from her arms, and she stumbled backward.
"My apologies, miss,"
he said, offering a hand to help her up. His eyes, a deep shade of emerald, sparkled with mischief. "Are you quite all right?" Harrietta felt her cheeks flame as she realized this was the first time a man had touched her, or rather, the first time she'd experienced being touched as a woman. It was electric. I'm fine, thank you," she stammered, placing her hand in his and feeling a strange tingle as he pulled her up. The young man, introduced as Mr. Charles Hawthorne, stayed for dinner that evening, and Harrietta found herself blushing and stammering whenever he glanced her way. She couldn't quite pinpoint the reason for her reaction. Was it merely the attention of a handsome man? Or was there something more to it? As the days passed, Harrietta noticed Mr. Hawthorne seeking her out, engaging her in conversation, and even going so far as to offer her a hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers.
"For you, Miss Harrietta,"
he said, with a charming smile.
"I thought they suited your spirit."
She accepted the flowers, her heart fluttering. "Why, thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. That's very kind." It was during these moments that Harrietta began to wonder if there might be benefits to her situation that she hadn't considered before. As winter approached, Harrietta's life at the inn grew more intriguing. She found herself drawn into the vibrant social life of Victorian London, attending balls and soirees with the other servants, even if it was only to help set up and serve. At one such ball, she found herself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching the swirling colors and graceful movements of the waltzing couples. A hand appeared before her, holding a champagne flute.
"Here, I think this is yours,"
said a deep voice. Harrietta turned to see Mr. Hawthorne standing beside her, his eyes twinkling. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the glass.
"May I have this dance?"
he asked, his voice warm and inviting. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized he was asking her to dance. "Oh, well, I suppose so," she stammered, surprised at his forwardness. Mr. Hawthorne led her to the dance floor, his hand resting gently at the small of her back. As they twirled and spun to the music, Harrietta felt lightheaded, not just from the motion but from the sensation of being held so closely by a handsome man.
"You dance beautifully, Miss Harrietta,"
he whispered, his breath warm on her ear. She blushed, her heart racing. "As do you, Mr. Hawthorne." As the dance ended, they stood for a moment, their bodies still close, and Harrietta found herself wondering what it would be like to be kissed by him.
Mr. Hawthorne, I presume?
A stern voice cut through the moment, and Henrietta looked up to see a formidable woman in an extravagant gown regarding them with suspicion.
Yes, mother,"
Mr. Hawthorne said, clearing his throat and quickly stepping back from Henrietta.
"May I introduce Miss Henrietta Wilson, the daughter of one of Father's business associates. Henrietta, this is my mother, Lady Hawthorne."
Henrietta curtsied, her heart sinking slightly as she realized Mr. Hawthorne had introduced her as someone else. "Charmed, Lady Hawthorne." Lady Hawthorne's gaze was sharp, and Henrietta could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she assessed the situation. "Of course, my dear. I do hope we shall see more of you soon." With that, she turned and swept away, leaving Henrietta feeling a mix of emotions. As the ball drew to a close, Mr. Hawthorne sought out Henrietta once more. "Miss Wilson, I do apologize for my mother's abruptness. I hope it won't deter you from accepting my invitation to the theater tomorrow evening." Henrietta's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, that is—" She struggled to find the right words, aware of the complications that now surrounded their interaction. "I shall have to consult my father on the matter, of course." Mr. Hawthorne smiled. "Of course. Until tomorrow, then." As Henrietta made her way back to the inn, her mind whirled. The evening had been a whirlwind of new experiences and emotions, and she felt like she was navigating uncharted territory. Back at the inn, Mrs. Wilson noticed Henrietta's pensive expression. "Is everything all right, dear? You seem deep in thought." Henrietta sighed. "I am, Mrs. Wilson. It's just, well, things are becoming rather complicated." And so, she poured out the tale of the evening's events, from the dance with Mr. Hawthorne to the unexpected introduction to his mother and the resulting invitation. Mrs. Wilson listened intently, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and motherly concern.
"Well, my dear, it seems your adventures as a woman are far from over. It's a delicate situation, to be sure, but I have no doubt you'll navigate it with grace and poise."
Henrietta smiled, grateful for Mrs. Wilson's support and guidance. "I can only hope so. It's all rather overwhelming." As Henrietta lay in bed that night, her mind raced with thoughts of Mr. Hawthorne and the unexpected turn her life had taken. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of his hand on her waist, the warmth of his breath on her ear. It was all so new, so thrilling, and yet so terribly complicated. The next morning, Henrietta went about her duties with a distracted air, her thoughts constantly drifting to the impending theater outing. As she dusted the mantelpiece in the parlor, Mrs. Wilson entered, a knowing smile on her face. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked, her tone gentle. Henrietta startled, nearly dropping the feather duster. "Oh, Mrs. Wilson! Well, yes, I suppose I am." The innkeeper sat down on the sofa, patting the space beside her. "Come, sit. Let's talk about it." Henrietta hesitated for a moment before joining her, smoothing her skirts as she sat. "I just don't know what to do, Mrs. Wilson. I mean, I'm not really who he thinks I am. And even if I were, there's the matter of his mother." Mrs. Wilson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a tricky situation, to be sure. But Henrietta, you must remember that you are a woman now, with all the complexities that entails. It's not just about playing a role, but about navigating the social nuances and expectations of this time." Henrietta sighed, twisting her hands in her lap. "I know, and that's what scares me. I feel like I'm constantly on the verge of making a mistake, of revealing myself as an imposter." "But you're not an imposter, my dear. You're a woman, through and through, and a remarkable one at that." Mrs. Wilson patted Henrietta's hand reassuringly. "Just be yourself and trust your instincts. They'll guide you true. Harrietta took a deep breath, feeling a bit more settled. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I don't know what I'd do without your guidance. The innkeeper smiled. You'd do just fine, I'm sure.
Now, let's see about getting you ready for this theater outing, shall we?
The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Harrietta and Mrs. Wilson prepared for the evening. There was a dress to be pressed, hair to be styled, and a myriad of other details to attend to. As the hour of the outing approached, Harrietta stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. The dress, a deep emerald that matched her eyes, hugged her curves in all the right places, and her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon with a few loose curls framing her face. You look stunning, my dear, Mrs. Wilson said from the doorway, her eyes misty. Harrietta turned, a nervous smile on her face. Do you really think so? I know so. Mr. Hawthorne won't be able to take his eyes off you. A knock at the front door signaled Mr. Hawthorne's arrival, and Harrietta took a deep breath, steeling herself. Well, here goes nothing. As she descended the stairs, she saw Mr. Hawthorne waiting in the foyer, looking dashing in a tailored suit. His eyes widened as he caught sight of her, and he stepped forward, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Miss Wilson, you look absolutely breathtaking, he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. Harrietta felt a blush creep up her neck. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. You look quite handsome yourself. He offered her his arm, and together they stepped out into the crisp evening air. A carriage awaited them, and Mr. Hawthorne helped Harrietta inside before joining her. As they rode through the lamplit streets of London, Harrietta felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was acutely aware of Mr. Hawthorne's presence beside her, of the way his leg brushed against hers with the sway of the carriage. I must confess, Miss Wilson, he said, breaking the silence. I've been looking. Harrietta glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. As have I, Mr. Hawthorne. The theater was a grand affair, with plush velvet seats and glittering chandeliers. As they took their seats in the private box, Harrietta couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. She had never experienced anything quite like this before. The play itself was a whirlwind of emotion and drama, and Harrietta found herself completely engrossed. She laughed, she cried, and she gasped along with the rest of the audience, lost in the story unfolding on stage. During a particularly emotional scene, she felt Mr. Hawthorne's hand cover hers where it rested on the armrest between them. She glanced at him, and he offered her a small, reassuring smile. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his, and felt a warmth spread through her at the contact. As the play ended and the audience erupted into applause, Harrietta reluctantly let go of Mr. Hawthorne's hand to join in. They stood, and he offered her his arm once more as they made their way out of the theater. That was absolutely wonderful, Harrietta gushed as they stepped out into the night air. I've never seen anything like it. Mr. Hawthorne smiled down at her, his eyes warm. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Miss Wilson. It's one of my favorites. They walked arm in arm through the bustling streets, chatting animatedly about the play and the performances. Harrietta found herself relaxing in Mr. Hawthorne's presence, laughing at his witty observations and offering her own insights. As they neared the inn, however, a figure stepped out of the shadows, causing them both to stop short. It was Lady Hawthorne, her expression severe. Charles, she said, her tone clipped. I thought I might find you here. Mr. Hawthorne stiffened, his grip on Harrietta's arm tightening slightly. Mother, what are you doing here? Lady Hawthorne's gaze flicked to Harrietta, her lips pursing. I could ask the same of you, Charles. What are you doing gallivanting about with this Woman. Henrietta felt a flush of embarrassment and anger rise in her cheeks. Before she could respond, however, Mr. Hawthorne spoke up. Mother, please. Miss Wilson is a friend, and I won't have you speaking about her in such a manner. Lady Hawthorne scoffed. A friend? Charles, don't be naive. She's clearly after your fortune, just like all the others. Henrietta's eyes widened, and she took a step back, stung. I assure you, Lady Hawthorne, I have no such intentions. Mr. Hawthorne placed a reassuring hand on Henrietta's back. Mother, you're out of line. I'll thank you to leave Miss Wilson out of whatever schemes you're concocting. Lady Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. Schemes? Charles, I'm trying to protect you. Can't you see that? I don't need your protection, Mother. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The two stared at each other for a long moment, the tension palpable. Finally, Lady Hawthorne broke the silence. Very well, Charles, but don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned on her heel and stalked off into the night. Henrietta let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mr. Hawthorne, I'm so sorry. I never meant to cause any trouble between you and your mother. He turned to her, his expression softening. You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Wilson. My mother's behavior was unacceptable, and I won't stand for it. He walked her to the door of the inn, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. As they reached the threshold, he turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. Miss Wilson, Henrietta, he said, his voice low and earnest. I hope you know that my intentions towards you are nothing but honorable. I care for you, deeply, and I want nothing more than to spend more time in your company. Henrietta's heart raced at his words, and she found herself getting lost in the depths of his eyes. I care for you too, Mr. Hawthorne. Charles. He smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Then let us not let anyone, not even my mother, stand in the way of what we have. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her cheek in a soft, chaste kiss. Henrietta's breath caught, and she felt a tingle spread from the spot where his lips had touched her skin. Good night, Henrietta, he whispered, stepping back. I shall call on you tomorrow. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Henrietta standing breathless in the doorway. She raised a hand to her cheek, hardly believing what had just transpired. As she made her way up to her room, her mind was a whirl of emotions. She knew that her situation was precarious, that she was walking a fine line between the truth and a carefully constructed lie. But in that moment, with the memory of Charles's kiss still fresh on her skin, she couldn't bring herself to care. She changed into her nightgown and crawled into bed, a smile playing at her lips as she replayed the events of the evening in her mind. For the first time since arriving in this strange, new world, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything would work out in the end. The next morning, Henrietta woke with a newfound sense of purpose. She went about her duties with a spring in her step, humming softly to herself as she worked. Mrs. Wilson noticed the change in her demeanor and pulled her aside with a knowing smile. I take it the theater outing went well. Henrietta blushed, unable to keep the grin from her face. It was wonderful, Mrs. Wilson. Truly wonderful. The innkeeper patted her hand. I'm so glad, my dear. You deserve a bit of happiness in your life. As the day wore on, Henrietta found herself growing increasingly anxious for Charles's promised visit. She changed her dress 3 times, fussing with her hair until it was just so. When the knock finally came at the door, she nearly tripped over her skirts in her haste to answer it. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress, before opening the door with a smile. Mr. Hawthorne, she greeted, her heart fluttering at the sight of him. Please, come in. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over her appreciatively. Miss Wilson, you look lovely as always. She led him to the parlor, where Mrs. Wilson had laid out a tray of tea and biscuits. They sat, and Harrietta poured the tea, her hands shaking slightly. I hope you don't mind me calling on you so soon, Charles said, accepting a cup from her. I found myself quite unable to stay away. Harrietta smiled, her cheeks warming. I don't mind at all. In fact, I was rather hoping you would. They chatted amiably, sipping their tea and nibbling on biscuits. Charles regaled her with stories of his travels, and Harrietta found herself hanging on his every word. As the afternoon wore on, Charles grew more serious, setting down his teacup and leaning forward. Harrietta, there's something I must ask you. She felt her heart skip a beat at the use of her given name. Yes, Charles? He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a now familiar gesture. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the Hawthorne family ball next week? I know it's short notice, but I can think of no one I'd rather have by my side. Harrietta's eyes widened, and she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. A ball at the Hawthorne estate? It was a daunting prospect, to be sure, but the thought of spending the evening on Charles' arm, of dancing in his embrace. I would be delighted, Charles, she said, a smile spreading across her face. Truly. His answering grin was blinding, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Wonderful. I shall count the days until then. As he took his leave, promising to call again soon, Harrietta found herself in a daze. A ball, a real, proper society ball. It was like something out of a dream. The next week passed in a flurry of preparation. Mrs. Wilson helped Harrietta select a gown, a stunning creation of deep blue silk that made her eyes sparkle. They spent hours practicing dances, giggling as they twirled around the inn's parlor. When the night of the ball finally arrived, Harrietta was a bundle of nerves. She stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. The gown fit like a glove, and her hair was swept up in an intricate style, with tendrils curling around her face. You look like a princess, Mrs. Wilson said, her eyes misty. Mr. Hawthorne won't be able to take his eyes off you. A knock at the door signaled Charles's arrival, and Harrietta took a deep breath, steeling herself. She descended the stairs, her heart in her throat, and saw him waiting in the foyer, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailcoat and top hat.
Harrietta,
he breathed, his eyes widening as he took her in. You look... I have no words. She smiled, ducking her head. Thank you, Charles. You look quite dashing yourself. He offered her his arm, and together they stepped out into the night. The carriage ride to the Hawthorne estate was filled with a nervous energy, their hands clasped tightly together. As they arrived at the manor, Harrietta couldn't help but gasp. It was a grand affair, with sweeping gardens and a facade that seemed to stretch on forever. Inside, the ballroom was a glittering wonderland, with crystal chandeliers and a sea of swirling gowns. Charles led her onto the dance floor, pulling her close as the orchestra struck up a waltz. As they moved together, Harrietta felt like she was floating, lost in the music and the feel of his arms around her. You're a natural, he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. It's like you were born to dance. She smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. With you, Charles. I feel like I could do anything. As the night wore on, they danced and laughed and sipped champagne, lost in their own little world. Harrietta caught sight of Lady Hawthorne across the room, her expression pinched as she watched them. But she found she didn't care. All that mattered was Charles and the way he made her feel. It was during a lull in the dancing that it happened. Charles led her out onto the terrace, the cool night air a balm on her flushed skin. They stood together, looking out over the gardens, their hands intertwined. "Harrietta," Charles said, his voice soft. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned to him, her heart in her throat. "Yes, Charles?" He took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. I'm in love with you, Harrietta. I have been, almost from the moment we met. You've captured my heart in a way I never thought possible." Harrietta felt tears prick at her eyes, a smile trembling on her lips. "Oh, Charles, I love you too, you, so much." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "Marry me, Harrietta. Be my wife, my partner in all things. I can't imagine my life without you in it." She nodded, a laugh bubbling up in her throat. "Yes, Charles, yes, 1,000 times, yes." He kissed her then, his lips soft and urgent against hers. Harrietta melted into him, her heart soaring. This, right here, was where she belonged, in his arms, in this time, in this place. As they broke apart, Charles rested his forehead against hers, a grin splitting his face. "We'll have to tell my mother, of course. She won't be happy, but I don't care. I love you, and that's all that matters." Harrietta leaned into Charles' embrace, feeling a sense of contentment wash over her. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, she couldn't help but think back to the life she had left behind. In the present day, she had been a man, living a life that had never quite felt right. She had always felt like an outsider, like she was wearing a mask that didn't fit. But here, in this time and place, everything felt different. As a woman, Harrietta felt like she could finally be herself. She no longer had to hide her true nature, to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Here, she could embrace her femininity, her softness, her grace. She thought back to the first time she had put on a dress, the way the silk had felt against her skin. It had been like a revelation, like a piece of herself sliding into place. She had looked in the mirror and seen herself, truly seen herself, for the first time. And then there was Charles. From the moment they had met, he had seen her for who she truly was. He had looked past the facade, past the mask, and seen the woman beneath. With him, she could be vulnerable, could be real in a way she had never been able to before. As they stood there on the terrace, the music from the ballroom drifting out to them on the night air, Harrietta knew that she never wanted to go back. This was where she belonged, who she was meant to be. As they turned to go back inside, Charles's arm wrapped around her waist, Harrietta felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was her life now, her truth, and she would never let it go.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!